On today's show, what's it going to look like when the NBA eventually expands the league and how it is going to benefit the Minnesota Timberwolves? It's all coming up on today's Locked On NBA.
You are Locked On NBA, your daily NBA podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up and welcome to another edition of Locked On NBA, the biggest stories with the local experts. I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, also host of Locked On Rockets right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the exact same page where you actually place your bets. You're going to get started with $200 in bonus bets, guaranteed, when you place your first $5 bet. Just head on over to FanDuel.com. You can take a look at so many different wagers, like the different weekly specials that they have, who's going to make the playoffs, win totals. My favorite, just go take a look at who's going to win the Super Bowl. Right now, the Kansas City Chiefs favorites to win at plus 500. Right behind them, you have the San Francisco 49ers at plus 650. And then in third place, the Buffalo Bills at plus 950 to win the Super Bowl this season. So all those odds and so much more, all available to you right at your fingertips. Just head on over. That's FanDuel.com. Joining us now is the host of Locked On Wolves, Ben Beecken, who you can track down wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Wolves. Ben, there has been a ton of speculation I'd be going back years now, but it feels like it's maybe heating up a little bit more as of late about the speculation about the NBA's potential or eventual expansion and adding, a couple more teams to the 30-team slate that already exists. And when you start getting into these discussions, these debates about the NBA eventually expanding, it feels less of a, if it's going to happen, more of a when it's ultimately going to happen. And the two cities, the two areas you keep coming back to, the two names you hear thrown around so often are Seattle and Las Vegas, the two cities kind of that it feels like are dead set to get a pair of NBA teams. I want to kind of start the conversation right there before we get into some of the Wolves stuff a little bit later on and how this potentially impacts them. But, can you think of another city that has maybe a legitimate claim to, be the new home of an NBA team aside from Seattle or Las Vegas?
Yeah, I think Mexico City is the other one that you hear occasionally. It is, Seattle, Las Vegas are for sure the two that we hear the most. Of course, the NBA's try to expand internationally. Every league is in the U.S., right? All major sports are. And the Timberwolves were there's been Mexico City games quite a bit in the last decade. The Wolves played there, a few years ago against the Spurs. So that's certainly a possibility if the NBA really does want to add a team to a third country. It seems certainly more likely than going overseas or something and doing something in Europe. There's also some cities in Canada, I think, that were mentioned in the most recent report. Of course, there used to be a team in Vancouver, and hasn't, they moved to Memphis, 20 years ago at this point, more than that. That to me is really those are really the only other ones. There's other cities that have NBA arenas that have been rumored. Kansas City's one, but I feel like that's less likely it's right between OKC and Minneapolis. It's like a 5-hour drive-ish to either one of those cities. The Bulls are close by. That's kind of probably Bulls and Thunder country, I would guess. So it really feels like it's Vegas and Seattle, and then the next tier would be Mexico City and maybe another city in Canada, whether it's Vancouver or like a Montreal or something like that. But that kind of feels like the next wave. And Adam Silver has said, of course, any successful organization would want to expand. We're still a few years off or whatever, but there will be multiple waves. Just like the NBA went from 29 to 30 and there were some relocations and stuff like that 20 plus years ago. So maybe it's another 6 years after that, but eventually I would believe there's teams in Mexico City and another team in Canada. But I still think 31 and 32 are Vegas and Seattle.
It feels like it's a guarantee almost at this point. I also like there's something nice about keeping an even number of teams in the league, right? Let's not go back to adding one team at a time. It feels
right.
Clunky when they do that. But look, Vegas. Let me backtrack for a split second here. Seattle, the obvious one is bring back the Supersonics, right there. It's still such a strong fan base, a strong pulse for basketball in that city. It was kind of a travesty that they got taken away in the first place, and there's already reporting, right, that suggests, hey, if it happens, if the Supersonics come back, the Thunder will relinquish the Sonics history back to them, which I think is a really cool move and not something that I think that they would technically have to do, given the, you know, what we've seen happen with teams being relocated to different cities and all that stuff throughout the NBA's history. So that's awesome. If Seattle gets a team, it's going to be the Supersonics, and the currently the Seattle Kraken ownership group is, like, you know, kind of spearheading a massive bid to be in position to kind of have both teams under one, you know, gigantic corporate umbrella entity, whatever. Not when it or not if it happens, but when it happens. The real question mark is the Las Vegas team. And we know that there's a guy who is currently front and center in the NBA landscape as an active player who would love to get his hands on being an owner of that team. And that's LeBron James, and potentially him, you know, throwing out his bid as a potential owner, a la Michael Jordan when he, you know, took over as an owner, you know, once he retired.
Yeah. And of course, you know, the Vegas thing, I mean, probably 8 to 10 years ago, I remember, you know, first getting mentioned as a possibility for an NBA team. And it's like, I never thought, like, it's not a huge market in terms of the people that actually live there. But now with the success of the Golden Knights there on the NHL side, like, that is, I think, what has made everybody be like, all right, this makes sense. And obviously now there's an NFL team there with the Raiders, and there's a strong possibility that Oakland ends up there very soon on the baseball side. So they could go from having 0 Big Four teams to having all 4 of the 4 major men's pro sports in America in a span of just a few years. But with the Golden Knights arena already there, I presume they'd play in that arena. It's a state-of-the-art arena. It makes a lot of sense. And you know, Adam Silver, I think the year that he mentioned in his press conference recently was like the 27-28 season, which is 3 years away now. And LeBron's definitely going to be retired by then. So I certainly see that as a real possibility.
We got to be really careful, right? Because we've been saying LeBron's going to retire, or he's going to start, like, waning for a while now. And look, we mentioned it on this. Oh, he'll be retired by then. And like 5 years down the line, we'll be like, wow, he's still kicking. What's happening?
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Well, and who knows? Maybe he gets involved, and maybe Bronny plays for the Vegas NBA team here in 3 seasons. Man, yeah, I mean, look, that would be a crazy outcome there. Now, here's the real question mark. With Seattle, it's easy because you just take back Supersonics. Awesome. I feel like it's going to be really hard to top the fact that the WNBA already has the Las Vegas Aces, which is easily one of the best team names in any professional sports league across the globe. I really struggle with coming up with what potential team names you would come up with for a Las Vegas men's basketball team. You got anything off the dome that you can hit me with? Because I've got a couple that I wrote down, but none of them work, like, incredibly well, unfortunately. Yeah, no, I don't. And I think so, like, the hockey team that's going to be in Utah, I think they're moving from Phoenix, if I remember right. They're playing as like the Utah Hockey Club, but they've released like a list of 5 names, and some of those are really cool. Now it's obvious Utah's very different than Vegas. Yeah. But, like, you know, like, the NHL's done a really good job. Golden Knights is great. Kraken is great. It's got to be something Vegas centric. I mean, I guess with the Raiders, I wonder if they'd probably rename the Oakland A's eventually too. But, like, yeah, how many, like, gambling they just casino?
They just go from the Oakland A's to the Oakland Aces. They
maybe.
Sorry, WNBA, we're just gonna borrow the Aces name too because it fits with our whole moniker. No, I mean, look, you could go card themed, right? You could go with Las Vegas Jokers. You could go with Las Vegas Spades. Aces is already taken. I saw one suggestion that said something. Just make them the Aces as well. Like, that maybe the NBA kind of fumbled when they originally had the WNBA, and that they went with different team names to kind of, you know, provide that distinction instead of just having, like, I don't know, you could have the women's Aces and the men's Aces, and then maybe kind of get back on track that way as a possibility.
Yeah, they certainly could. And I know that minor league baseball, there's a team there, the Las Vegas Aviators is who play. That's probably where Oakland's going to play on, you know, the Oakland A's are going to play. They previously were 10, 15 years ago, they were the 51. So they embraced the Area 51 thing. So, like, it's always a possibility they could lean into, like, I don't think they would be like the aliens, but, like, they could come up with something in, like, that extraterrestrial, you know, realm if they don't go the gambling route. And you never know with the NBA, like, of all the major sports, the NBA's had, I think, more gambling, you know, scandals, at least this side of Pete Rose, at least in recent years. So maybe the NBA is a little nervous about that. I don't know. Who knows? But
watch, it's gonna be the Las Vegas DraftKings. It's gonna be the Las Vegas
there you go. Yeah,
they'll just or something like that.
Go all in with naming rights for a team. Yeah.
Look, so pivoting to the kind of the Minnesota angle of all this. not if, but when it happens, when it's Las Vegas and Seattle, then that would necessitate one of the current Western Conference teams to move out east, because you'd have at that point 17 teams in the West and only 15 teams in the East. And it feels like there's a handful of teams that would make sense to move out to the East. You look at 3 teams in particular: the Pelicans, the Grizzlies, and then the Timberwolves. What's your case for, Ben, why the T-Wolves should be the team that gets moved out to the Eastern Conference?
Yeah, I mean, they're a short flight from every team in the Central Division, I guess it is, in the Eastern Conference. I mean, Milwaukee, Chicago, the Pacers, and either the Pistons or the Cavs, those states are all adjacent to one another. And currently the Timberwolves have to fly over minimum of 3 states to get to any of their divisional opponents. The Wolves routinely fly the most miles of any team in the country. And on its face, you'd be like, well, they're in the middle of the country. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Shouldn't they be close to a lot of teams? Well, if you look at an actual map of teams, there's a huge swath of the country, which perhaps in some cases aptly named flyover country. There's no teams between Minnesota and Oklahoma City, between Minnesota and Denver, and they're in the same division as the Portland Trailblazers. In fact, I'm pretty sure this is true. They're the only team that has to skip over 2 time zones to play a divisional opponent. Most divisional opponents are in the same time zone and sometimes one time zone over, but they've got to fly to the West Coast to take on a divisional opponent, which is 2 hours earlier. So it's actually a pretty easy case. Like if you just look at the actual longitude, like Memphis and New Orleans are slightly further east, but it's much easier to form a division that's like, right there in the center of the country. Look at all the other sports. I mean, the NFL, you've got Detroit, Chicago, Green Bay, Minnesota. And in baseball, you've got the central divisions are right there in the middle of the country as well, with the Cardinals and the Royals, as well as the teams in Chicago and Milwaukee and Minnesota. The NBA is the outlier, where the Wolves have to fly over literally 3 states to get to a divisional opponent. So it makes the most sense to go ahead and just shift Minnesota over. Wolves fans have been saying this, of course, now for decades, because the Eastern Conference is pretty much always much easier. Now, of course, Milwaukee's good, but like otherwise that division, 3 years from now, it's going to look different. But at least for the last 20 years, other than a couple of, obviously, Milwaukee winning a title, or the Pacers being good for a couple stretches in there, and of course when the Cavs had LeBron, but like Detroit and the Bulls haven't been very good in the last 20 years. And so Wolves fans have been thinking about this, like, hey, that would be a lot better than dealing with Jokic, than dealing with Sam Presti and the Thunder, than dealing with the Jazz. Always seem to be decent, and Portland, always seem to be. Both those teams are kind of like, it feels like, hanging around. They're never truly awful for too long. And the Western Conference as a whole is just so difficult. So yeah, there's a very clear case to move Minnesota to a division with, the Bulls, the Bucks, the Pacers, and either the Pistons or the Cavs. And you just kind of shuffle them at that point. And of course, Vegas and Seattle are going to have to be in the Western Conference. So I don't think it's a big stretch at all. And then you can also do like a Southern division, add the Thunder to the same division as the Texas teams, really, if you want to, or you can add Memphis to that division as well.
No. Get them out of here. I want no part of Chet Holmgren in the division and SGA in the division that I have to cover. Okay, stop putting pressure on the Rockets.
It's a short drive down I-35 to all those Texas teams. So I think that's the move. Yeah.
When will NBA expansion ultimately happen? Will the Minnesota Timberwolves be the team that makes it out to the Eastern Conference? You're going to have us covered for all of that and so much more over at Locked On Wolves. Ben, thanks for stopping by Locked On NBA with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.